ගෙවිඳු මේ ඔයාට හොස් තියලා තියෙන්නේ මම මේ YouTube එකෙන් බලන්නේ ඔයා මේකෙන් කරන්න YouTube එකේ ලයිව් යනකොට
හරි සර්. හරි.
ගෙවිඳු ආද කරන්නේ කෝසේෂන් නේද?
ඔව් කෝසේෂන් එක.
හරි ගෙවිඳු ඔයා කරන්න ළමයි YouTube එකෙන් ගොඩක් අය බලන්නේ මේ මොකද
Right. Before I start, I'll share my screen. Just confirm if you can see. Yeah. So before we start, I apologize for the small delay. But so today we'll be discussing about causation under criminal law, basically. So yeah. Yeah. I hope I'm audible. Can someone confirm whether I can be heard? Just even a thumbs up is fine. Yeah. And just confirm. Yeah. Yeah. So moving into causation. So before I explain causation, since you all didn't necessarily want a separate session on elements of crime, I'll start with that because causation is somewhat related to elements of crime. So I'll start with that. So when it comes to crime, um, in terms of like criminal law, when we look at criminal liability, we basically look at two key elements for a crime. The first being actus reus, right? And the second being mens rea, right? I'm sure you guys are very much aware of this by now, but actus reus is basically the criminal action, right? It's the act of the crime, right? While mens rea is, of course, the mental element of the crime. That's basically the intention, or anything to do with what contributes to the action, right? Of course, when it comes to certain crimes, there are certain crimes where mens rea is not necessarily required, right? Those are called crimes of strict liability, right? Which will be covered later on. But when it comes to a crime in general, unless under specific circumstances, a crime would consist of both actus reus and mens rea, right? So actus reus, like I said, is basically the act, which is of course sanctioned by the law. And then mens rea is basically the intention that leads to this act, or basically the mental element that leads to the act, right? So if we firstly look at crime in general, right? Crime is basically something that has been prohibited by the law, right? So if you commit an action that is prohibited by law, that is a crime, right? It's very simple, right? So that action is the actus reus, and the the mental element or the intention or the thought that drives a person to that action is the mens rea, right? Um, so from there on, if we move from elements to causation, the importance of causation in criminal law is to especially create a link between the action of the crime, that's actus reus, right? The action and the consequence of the crime. So for a crime to become for an action that is for a certain action to become a crime, that crime has to bear a certain consequence, right? Now, for an example, let's say you stab a person, right? So depending on the consequence. Now, if you stab a person, let's say like generally, if you stab a person, right, it could either cause harm to that person, or it could cause harm to the extent that he dies. So if he dies of that harm, that would amount to murder, right? So the action and the consequence is also as important as the action when we consider um, sorry.
नहीं नहीं पर
Yeah, so the action is the consequence is as important as the action in a crime, right? So if we look at the consequence in some actions, in some uh, crimes, the consequence is the important part, right? So let's say, for an example, murder, right? Um, an action should cause death for it to be considered as murder, right? Or let's say a person causes an injury which is likely to cause death, that becomes murder, right? Just because you cause an injury, that doesn't necessarily mean it's murder, right? A murder is an action that would cause a bodily injury which would result in murder, right? So that's murder, right? So which would result in death, that is murder, right? Um, so when we look at criminal law, the consequence of an act, that is the result of an act, right? What happens due to something, right? That is also important as much as the act, right? So now if you stab someone, the stabbing is also a part of the crime, but also the consequence, right? If the person dies by the stabbing, then it's murder, right? So to establish criminal liability, the consequence is also important. So what happens under causation is basically we draw a link between the action of an accused or an offender and the consequence of the act, right? So we have to draw a causal link or like a chain basically between these two incidences and see whether this act was a direct or this act directly caused the consequence that happened, right? Let's say now murder. If someone had stabbed someone, was the stabbing direct the direct factor that influenced the death of that person, or was it something else, right? So when it comes to criminal liability, when we establish criminal liability, we have to establish that a particular act was directly responsible for that consequence, right? For murder, for uh, for the death of a person, or anything for that matter, causing harm, right? Um, so we have to show a link. So we normally call this like, so causation is basically a chain between the act of crime and the consequence of the crime, right? So this becomes very important in criminal law. Why? Because just proving an act is not enough, right? We have to show that that act created a consequence. Otherwise, it's not murder, right? Let's say now, murder is the very easiest example here, right? Just because you prove that someone stabbed a person, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's liable for murder. Why? You have to show that that injury that stabbing was directly or had directly influenced the death of that person, right? So you have to draw that link. If that link is not drawn, then there is no criminal liability. And even though that person is responsible, he will be acquitted, right? Why? Because there's no liability created. For criminal liability to be created on an offender, you have to show that the act had a direct link with the consequence, right? So that's done under causation. So that's why causation is a fundamental doctrine or element of criminal law. Because without causation, you can't establish criminal liability, right? So I'll continue with from there, right? So when it comes to causation, we have two types of causation, right? Or basically, this is two ways in which we look at causation, right? So the first type of causation is factual causation, and the second is legal causation, right? So when it comes to factual causation, we talk about a concept called sine qua non, right? Sine qua non is basically it's a Latin term. So what it means is without which nothing. So the basic meaning of this doctrine is to say that a particular action or a particular consequence would not have happened if it wasn't for a certain act by the offender, right? Let's say for an example, murder, right? If a person hadn't, let's say, two people, right, A and B. If A shot B and B died, if A hadn't shot B, B wouldn't have died, right? Right. So basically, if A shoots B and B dies, if not for A shooting B, B would not have died, right? So that's the basic implication, right? That's the factual causation, where we look at whether the consequence was a direct result of that act, right? And if it wasn't for that act, whether that consequence would have happened, right? Now, so in that case, in the instance I mentioned, right, A shoots B and B dies, right? So B's death is the consequence, right? So if A, so A shot B, right, and as a result, B died, right? So B dying is the consequence, right? If A hadn't shot B, B wouldn't have died, right? Um, Hold on. Yeah, sure. Yeah, definitely. So I think must have been a bit complex. I'll just try my best to keep it simple, right? I'll try to use more examples. I think using examples would help a bit. The reason is when it comes to these concepts, like it's very complicated. I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. If it's difficult, just ask me to repeat, right? So I'll repeat this again, right? Um, so again, right? So A killed B, right? So B died, right? Because of A shooting B, right? So now B's death is a direct result of A shooting him, right? Now, if A hadn't shot B, then B wouldn't have died, right? So that's the causal link we create, right? So if A didn't shoot, if that action didn't happen, right? Now A takes a pistol and shoots, right? If A shooting B doesn't happen, then B is still alive, right? B would not have died, right? So that's the factual causation, without which nothing. Meaning, if A hadn't shot, B wouldn't have died, right? So this is called the but-for test. So basically, like, let's say, for an example, A would have been alive. Sorry, A would, so the basic, so in that instance, I explained, B died because of A shooting, right? But B would have been alive if it wasn't for A shooting him, right? So, but because of A's conduct, right? So B would not have died but for A shooting him, right? But for means basically if it wasn't for, right? If A hadn't shot B, B would have still been alive, right? So that's the factual causation side of things. But like, let's say we'll move on from that example, right? Um, let's say now a person, um, let's say there was a person, right? Now, um, he had let's say he had a fractured rib cage, right? So he had a fractured rib cage, and then yeah, there's another message. Yeah. If A shoots B, we let's Yes, exactly. Yeah. So in terms of factual causation, yes. So that example, there's small like a question regarding factual causation. So during factual causation, so let's say now again the same instance I mentioned, right? A shoots B and B dies because of A shooting, right? Now let's say B when A starts to shoot, B runs away and he falls off a cliff and he dies, right? Now that's not factual causation, right? Because again, like it's not a direct result as per se, but again, if A had not shot, right? If A had not started shooting B, he wouldn't have started running away, right? He wouldn't have started running away. So that comes under legal causation. I'll move into that. But the factual causation, the basic idea is the but for test, right? So what I mean here is if A hadn't done what he did, B would have survived. B wouldn't have died. That consequence wouldn't have happened, right? If A hadn't shot, right? So that's the idea. But if A had shot and B didn't obviously be missed or he missed the shot. Let's say he somehow eluded the shooting. And afterwards, uh, let's say someone else comes and hits him, right? And he dies, right? Let's say some other third party who was hanging on close to him comes and hits him with or stabs him with a knife and he dies, right? Now then A is not responsible with that death, right? He was just shooting and B escaped, right? But then later on, another guy comes and stabs him and he dies. Now there you can't draw a causal link, right? B would have survived even if A shot, right? Why? Because even if A was shooting, B had avoided the bullets, and then someone else came and killed. So that doesn't necessarily mean that A is responsible for that action, right? If by trying now, if when B was trying to avoid the bullets, someone else came and killed him, then yes, you can say that if it wasn't for A's shooting, this guy would have noticed him and he would have escaped, right? But if after the shooting, and if he was shooting and this guy somehow took reasonable, let's say he hid somewhere, right? And then someone comes and attacks him, then it's not a direct result of A doing something, right? If A had even like A was continuing A continued to shoot bullets, right? But B was hiding, right? While he was hiding, if someone comes and kills him, that's not A's problem, right? A is not directly responsible, right? If A's action was completed and then B was killed by someone else by stabbing or something, then A is not responsible, right? Even if A had shot, B wouldn't have died, right? So that's the test, right? You always see if A hadn't shot, B would have survived. But if A had shot and B still would have survived, then the factual causation does not take place, right? Is that clear, guys? Yeah, okay. Right. So then moving into legal causation. Now, this is the second stage of causation, basically. Second stage in the sense, this is a different way of looking at things. So in this case, what happens is we look at something called proximate causation. So here, what we basically look into is whether the actions of uh, the offender was substantial and operative enough to cause the consequence, right? This is normally applied when the consequence is caused, but it's caused due to different reasons. Now, for an example, if again, I'll take the previous example I mentioned, A started shooting B, right? Now, B trying to escape, he falls off a cliff and he dies, right? He falls off a cliff and he dies. Then it's not directly what A intended to kill him. Yes, that's true. The death part did happen, but it was not by a bullet of A, right? The bullet was supposed to kill him, right? The shooting was done to ensure that the bullet hits him and he dies, right? But now B trying to escape from A because he was shooting, he falls off a cliff and he dies. Now, when that happens, again you can link it up, right? Again you can link it up. Why? Because of this proximate causation idea. So what happens here is the the action that A had taken. Let's say now A was shooting B, and B was close to a cliff, right? Now he got scared and he panicked and he started moving around, and without him intentionally jumping off, he had fallen off the cliff, right? He had fallen off the cliff. Uh, yeah, exactly. Uh, when he ran, so when he, let's say, A was shooting and B ran away, and while running away, he fell off the cliff, he died. So again, he died because of A. Why? Because A was shooting him. So he trying to escape, he died, right? So it was a natural consequence of A's action, right? So what B did, he tried to escape and he tried to hide from A. While trying to hide from A, if he dies, let's say again, it's a different action, right? B trying to escape, it's a different act, but it's a result of A's act, right? Because A is shooting, B is trying to hide, right? B is trying to hide or escape, right? While trying to do that, if he falls off a cliff or if he's knocked down by a car or something of that sort, and if he dies, again, still A is responsible. Why? Because there was a it was proximate, right? It was proximate, and also it was a substantial cause of the death, right? Because he was running away, right? Why was he running away? Because they were shooting, right? Uh, so this is legal causation. Now, factual causation is very direct, right? Whether it was very direct, whether the consequence was direct. Now, if that doesn't comply with, you come into legal causation. So under legal causation, we follow a reasonable test. So what happens is we look at whether the action of B was foreseeable for a reasonable man. So what that means is, for a reasonable person, if we give the facts to a reasonable person, would he imply that B would have done something like this? Now, if a person starts shooting you, it's reasonable for you to hide, right? You wouldn't necessarily, like, stand upright in front of the bullets and try to die, right? You would obviously try to hide, right? So that's a reasonable act or a reasonable reaction to what A was doing, right? Trying to escape, trying to hide, trying to save yourself, right? That's a reasonable act, right? So for a reasonable person, he should be able to know, or he should be able to uh, foresee the actions of the victim, right? Now the victim tried to escape. That's natural, right? That's natural and reasonable, right? He would try to escape if something of this, if someone is shooting, right? So that's the legal causation. Or for legal causation, we use this subjective test, we use a reasonable test, which I'll get to later with a case. But that's the basic test, right? You see whether it's reasonable for him to do something like that as a result of whatever the offender is doing, right? So that's the basic classification of causation. So classification, in the sense, we basically use both these concepts. But if factual causation doesn't imply, you always move into legal causation. That normally happens when the consequence is not as direct as we think, right? If there's something that sort of, if there's something different, some different occurrence to what A had intended. Now, A wanted to kill B by shooting him with a bullet, right? By shooting him with a gun, by the bullets hitting him, right? But he ended up dying by falling off a cliff. But the consequence is the same, but the direct result is not the same. But still, A is responsible. Why? Because B was trying to escape. So that's the idea, right? So then I'll move into how we could challenge causation. Now, causation can be challenged in few ways, right? The first way we use is it's called multiple causes, where uh, someone's death, or let's say some consequence, is caused by multiple things, right? Let's say a lot of things affect someone's death, right? let's say someone is let's say someone is poisoned or something, right? Um, then while being poisoned, he also had some sort of a disease which would aggravate the poison and he dies, right? So there are many factors that are contributory, right? In that sort of a situation, the causal link can be broken in some way or another, right? Let's say, for an example, someone stabs, no, A stabs B, but then obviously the wound was very minor. But then on his way, he was taken to a hospital to treat him, to be treated. And then inside the hospital, someone had, let's say, accidentally injected a different medicine to him, right? Something fatal, right? Or something which could have caused the injury to be fatal. Then he dies. Then again, there are questions raised, right? Was the wound the direct reason for him to die? Or was it the medical negligence, right? So there could be questions, right? So in that sort of a situation, what we use is the substantial factor test. So what we look at here is whether what A did was a substantial reason for what happened to B, right? Now, let's say it was a stabbing, right? If a person was stabbed and he was taken to hospital, but then in the hospital, he doesn't die of the wound, but while staying now, let's say the wound was not that fatal, but he was being treated. And at the hospital, he contracts, let's say this is during COVID, he contracts COVID-19. And then he dies because of COVID. Now, if he dies because of COVID, it's not necessarily directly linked to what A did, right? Of course, yes, you could say that he was taken to hospital because of what A did. But again, the injury caused by A was not the direct reason, right? The injury caused by A. So if the injury caused by A was not the direct reason for B's death, but the direct cause of the cause of death was actually COVID and him getting pneumonia or something, then the substantial factor test can be used and you could see, right? A's action was not the substantial reason for B's death, right? Then he could be acquitted, right? That's why causation is very important, right? You do something wrong, but then he doesn't die because of what you did, but he dies because of something else. If you can prove that, you can break the causal link and you can be acquitted, right? That's why it's important. That's why causation is important, right? Uh, so that's multiple causes. And the second challenge, this is, I guess, the most important, and I guess this is what most people use to break causal links. It's called intervening acts, novus actus intervenis. So novus actus intervenis is basically, uh, in this case, what we look at is whether there were any unforeseeable or independent events that broke the causal link between the act of the crime and the consequence, right? Um, Now, why I say unforeseeable and independent, I'll get to later. But here, what we look at is whether now, let's say, if someone was stabbed again, take the stabbing example. If someone was stabbed and while he was being, and if he dies in the hospital, he was taken to hospital and he died in the hospital, whether something happened in between that period. Let's say, for an example, if someone was stabbed today, right, 4th of December, someone was stabbed and he died on the 6th of December. Did something happen between the 4th of December and the 6th of December which resulted in him dying, right? Which aggravated him or aggravated his condition for him to die, right? Did something else happen? And was something else the reason for his death, right? So those are factors we consider as well, right? So intervening acts are basically actions that happen between the act and the consequence, of the act, which could break the causal link, basically, right? Um, so normally, if we consider the normal acts that could happen in between, we can divide it into three. One is the conduct of the victim. what the victim would do. Now, for an example, if let's say you were wounded, and then let's say you were stabbed near your stabbed in your abdomen, right? And then now um, the victim maliciously wants the offender to be convicted of murder. So something the offender has done, so he wants the offender to be convicted. So he decides that he should die for the offender to be convicted. So he takes the knife, he aggravates the wound, he pushes into the abdomen and he aggravates the wound so that he would die, right? Then again, it's an intervening act, right? It's something that the victim does, right? The victim did by himself, independent of what the offender did, right? He took a knife and he killed himself, right? So now that doesn't necessarily mean that the offender is responsible, right? It was, yes, the offender did cause a wound, but maybe it was not fatal and it was made fatal by the victim, right? The victim himself acting alone made it fatal. Then you can break the causal link, right? Why did he die? Because of his own action, right? So that's one way. And the second way is the conduct of a third party. Now, let's say again, uh, a stabbing incident, right? You were wounded. Yeah, sorry, there's a question. Can you give examples for one? Okay. By one, did you mean multiple causes or? Ah, yeah, victim. Yeah, exactly. That's what I said. So conduct to the victim, right? Conduct to the victim, right? Not multiple causes, right? Wanted examples? Okay, victim. Yeah. Okay. So again, I'll just brief you on that example that I gave, right? So let's say someone stabs, say A stabs B, right? Now B is stabbed and he has an injury, but that injury is not fatal, right? Let's say it's not fatal. But then B wants A to be convicted of murder. He has some sort of grudge with A, so he wants. Now, these are all hypothetical, right? Not real circumstances, but very hypothetical. Right? Let's say B wants A to be convicted of murder. Let's say he has some sort of a history with A and he wants A to be convicted of murder and for him to remain in prison for life, or let's say if it's death penalty, for him to be killed. So then what he would do is he takes this independent what happened, right? He was injured and he's injured now. He has an injury, but it's not fatal. The victim goes, he takes a knife and he basically aggravates the wound to the extent where it becomes fatal, right? You push the knife in and you make the wound worse, right? To the extent that it would kill him, right? And he dies of that. Let's say he dies of that wound. The wound he himself sort of aggravated, right? And killed, right? Because of that wound, he died. Now, it's the conduct of the victim that caused the death in the end, right? Not necessarily what the offender did. Yes, the offender did cause an injury, but it was the acts of the victim that killed him, right? Not what the offender necessarily did, right? So then the offender cannot be charged for murder. Why? Because the death happened due to what the victim did, right? Not due to the criminal act, right? Is that clear? Do you want another example? So, yes, exactly. In those cases, normally when the victim does something, we don't look at the multiple. Yeah, you can look at that also, but it's normally an intervening act, right? It happens between the act and the consequence. In multiple causes, what happens is a lot of things happen together, right? A lot of actions happen together. Right? If a murder is caused by a lot of things, what's the most substantial thing that would cause the murder? That's what we look at, right? Here, what we look at is in the gap what happened, right? Uh, yeah. Then conduct of the third party. Like I said, third party also same, right? if someone, again, same scenario, like someone stabs you, someone causes an injury, but it's not fatal. And if someone else comes and aggravates that wound for you to die, then it's not that initial guy who caused, let's say, caused an injury to B, and C comes and aggravates the wound so that B dies, right? Then A is not directly responsible. It was the conduct of C that eventually caused the death of B, right? So again, you can break the causal link, and then you finally have then we also have natural events. Now, natural events are basically in contract law. Also, we spoke about this acts of God, right? So an act of God is basically something that's natural, right? It's let's say disasters and stuff like that are acts of God. We consider them to be acts of God in contract law. So similarly, in criminal law, also, what happens is now, let's say an injury, let's say someone uh, pushes you down, let's say a flight of, let's say a few steps, right? You're pushed down a flight of steps, right? And while going down, because there was a really, let's say, strong breeze, you were pushed really hard. And then because of the breeze, you go rolling down and you fall off, let's say, some sort of balcony. That's a natural event, right? That's a natural event. So now that guy just slightly pushed you, like he just pushed you. He didn't want you to go and like flow down the staircase and all of that. If that was caused by the wind, let's say some sort of a wind pushed you away and you fell down the flight of steps because of that, then he is not responsible, right? What he did was a slight push. So he is not responsible for the murder directly, right? So again, a natural event, right? So a natural event, but this should be independent, right? Let's say again an injury. Someone is injured, right? Someone causes an injury, and on your way, you get caught to let's say a flood, and you die, right? Now again, he is not responsible. He just caused an injury. That injury was not fatal, but later, because of a flood, he dies. Now then, you can't just create a causal link between the act and the consequence, right? Because it was a natural event, which is independent of what happened, right? So that's the idea, right? So those are intervening events. So when it comes to intervening events, I mentioned this at the start itself. It should be independent and it should also be unforeseeable. Why I said that was to use that reasonable test that I mentioned earlier. So for legal causation, we spoke about proximity and how it's a operative clause, right? So for a reasonable test, when we apply the reasonable test, this whole intervening event should be independent and unforeseeable. Now, let's say for an example, now the previous example I gave, right? Now, a reasonable person wouldn't have, now, if A stabbed B and if the wound was not fatal, a reasonable man wouldn't have taken a knife and tried to kill himself, no? Right? So that's unforeseeable, right? If a reasonable person wouldn't do that, that's unforeseeable, right? It's not something a reasonable man would have done, right? So in that sort of a situation, the intervening event becomes independent and unforeseeable, right? Because that's not something a normal man or a reasonable man would have done, right? So that's how intervening events are categorized or are distinguished from a foreseeable event, right? Now, the previous example that I gave, A was shooting B, and B trying to escape. He falls off a cliff and dies. Now, that's a reasonable thing. A person running away, trying to hide, and as a result, falling down is reasonable, right? That's how you would normally react, right? Uh, now, uh, and that action, and then let's say the victim, let's say the example I gave afterwards, right? He was stabbed and the victim tries to kill himself. Now, that's not reasonable, right? So that's how we use the reasonable test. So the reasonable test was used in the case of Regina versus Roberts, right? Uh, so in this case, uh, uh, what happened was what happened was this the victim uh, had gotten a lift from a guy who she met at a party, right? And on their way, the guy tried to make certain sexual advances, right? And because of these sexual advances, she wanted to escape. And uh, because she obviously wanted to escape, she opens the door of the car, the moving vehicle, and she jumps out, right? And by trying to jump out, obviously after jumping out, obviously because the vehicle was moving and all of that, she sustains injuries, right? She falls down and she sustains few injuries. And then this guy, the offender, was convicted for bodily harm, right? So he was convicted, right? Though he was making sexual advances, he was convicted for bodily harm, right? Why? Because what he was doing, the consequence of what he did, the sexual advances, resulted in her trying to jump out, right? So she jumped out and she had obviously sustained certain injuries, right? He was directly responsible for the injuries because of that causal link. Now, the act what he did resulted in her trying to jump out. And as a result, she sustained injuries. And as a result, he was convicted. Uh, yeah, so there, of course, you can use the factual causation. So if it wasn't for his sexual advances, she wouldn't have jumped out, right? So you can use that also. But you can use legal causation also, either way. Like you can use both, anything is fine, right? But you can use factual causation also, right? If it wasn't for his act, she wouldn't have jumped out, right? And she wouldn't have been sustained injuries, right? So you can use both there. And again, if you put this to a reasonable test, that's what a reasonable person would have done, right? If someone is making advances, they would have jumped, they would have tried to resist it, right? A reasonable person. And a reasonable person in this instance, to resist it, what they could do is they could jump out of the car, right? So she did that, and that was reasonable, and therefore it was, uh, though it was an intervening event, you can say it was, and you can say it was not something A did, but it was a foreseeable consequence of what A did, right? Because A did that, B jumped out, right? So because of B jumping out, she sustained injury, right? So that's the idea, right? Yeah. Any questions from this test? This is like very important. That's why I wanted to like clarify. Okay, I'll take that as a no. If you all do have any questions, like just send it through the chat. That's fine, right? Um, and in the next case, that's Regina versus Block. So in this case, what happened was, a person was making sexual advances again, and then since the victim had refused the advances, the offender had stabbed the victim 4 times, right? So that's what happened, right? And then you could say that yes, now she was stabbed 4 times, but she was taken to hospital, right? So um, she was taken to hospital for medical treatment. Now, just because you stab a person, it depends on where you stab the person, but in some circumstances, you can save a person, right? Though they're stabbed, right? So because she was stabbed and because she was losing a lot of blood, she required a blood transfusion. So blood transfusion is where you give more blood, right, to the victim from outside. But this victim had followed her religious faith and belief, um, had a view that no one should take or no one should undergo blood transfusion. So, in her faith, it was considered that blood transfusion was something wrong, right? That's according to her faith, right? So, according to her faith, she couldn't go for a blood transfusion. And as a result of not having a blood transfusion, she died. Right? She died because she couldn't get a blood transfusion on time. Right? Now again, you can put the test into application here, but there's a bit of a difference here, right? In this case, she had refused medical treatment. Now, if this medical treatment was given, we can imply that she would have survived, right? You can imply that, right? Okay, she would have given, if there was a medical blood transfusion, she wouldn't have lost that much blood. And if she died because of losing so much blood, then you could say that if a medical treatment was given, um, she could have survived, right? But again, the causal link is not broken again, right? Why? Because uh, she wouldn't have been in this sort of a circumstance if it wasn't for the guy's stab, right? If he hadn't stabbed her, she wouldn't have anyways needed a blood transfusion, right? She wouldn't have needed a blood transfusion. So because of that, you can't break the causal link, right? And also in these cases, uh, since there was this omission from her, like it wasn't now in this instance, she said no to blood transfusion, right? So that's called an omission, right? You say no to something, but it wasn't something that she did, right? If she had taken some sort of a wrong blood group and gone and transfused blood, and if she had died, then that's something positive. That's something she had done. Now, a person running away from a person shooting at him, that's a positive act. That's something he does. But here she had omitted. She had said no to something, right? Again, similar to in the previous case also, she jumped out of the car, right? That's a positive act, right? Whereas in this case, it was an omission. She said no to blood transfusion, right? So in this sort of situations, we apply a rule called the eggshell skull rule, or you can also call it the thin skull rule. So what this rule basically says is a defendant would be liable to certain unforeseeable or uncommon reactions of the plaintiff. Now, this goes with the concept that the defendant should accept the victim for who she is. Now, when you try and cause when let's say A and B in this case also, if A tried to A stab B, while stabbing B, he should accept that B is a follower of a certain faith, uh, and other characters of her as well, not only her physical appearance, right? Now, when you stab someone, if you want to kill that person, you would try and stab them on the heart, right? Now, in this sort of a situation, even if he had stabbed her somewhere else, since she couldn't go for a blood transfusion because of her faith, she would have died, right? So, along with the physical factors that attribute to the crime, you should also accept everything else of that person, her faith, uh, anything, her faith, her ideologies, everything, right? And the defendant, by causing or by doing the act or by causing the harm, is liable for all those uncommon reactions as well, right? And that's established by the thin skull rule, right? Even though he had not, you can say he didn't know that or whatnot, but by harming a person of that nature, you should accept all the attributes of her, not only the physical attributes, but also her ideologies, her let's say, religious or faiths, and all of that, right? So that's established under this case, right? So the thin skull rule. So this is normally applied when someone omits something. Someone says no to medical treatment, or says no to being transported by an ambulance, says no to a vaccine, right? Uh, says yeah, something like that, right? Says no to a transplant, right? Some sort of a kidney transplant or something, right? Let's say someone's kidney was damaged due to a stabbing, and if he has to go for a transplant, if he says no, then again, it's an omission. But again, thin skull rule. right? You can say that that was his fate, and the defendant is liable for those reactions as well, right? So that's the finding of that case. That's also important. So not only a positive act, but also an omission, you can still maintain the causal link, right? Um, yeah. So when it comes to like the sections of the penal code relevant to causation, especially for murder, right? We can use the first and second explanation of section 293 of the penal code, right? Um, so section 293, the explanation 1 and 2 uh, says that a person who causes bodily harm to another who is laboring under a disorder, disease, or bodily infirmity and thereby accelerates the death of that other shall be deemed to have caused his death. Now, let's say someone, there are cases for this as well, right? I'll get to that later, but there are cases for this as well. Let's say um, someone had some, again, like the example I mentioned earlier. Let's say um, someone was anemic or something, right? Or no, not anemic. Let's say someone had a very low blood clotting rate, right? And then let's say you stab someone or you cause an injury, and because he has a very low blood clotting rate, he loses blood, like he loses blood very fast. And because of that, if he dies, again, he's still responsible. He didn't want to. Let's say you can say, okay, the injury was caused on his arm, but he lost enough blood for him to die, right? So again, it's due to a disorder or some sort of a bodily infirmity of that person. But if the injury that he caused was accelerated because of this infirmity and still he died, still he is responsible for the death, right? There could be other external factors, but again, he's responsible, right? There's a question. Yeah, so culpable homicide, I'll get to that. There's a case for that as well. So you can say now in Sri Lanka, under Sri Lankan law, murder, for an offense to be murder, you should have the intention to cause bodily harm, which would result in the person dying, right? Your intention should be that you're causing a bodily harm that would result in the person's death, right? So now you can say that his intention was not to cause bodily harm, but not to cause bodily harm that would amount to murder. Then you can say yes, it's culpable of homicide, not amounting to murder. There's a case for that. I'll get to that. But till then, yes, it's basically that. Yeah. So, but in this sort of a situation, what happens is now this is section 293, right? 293 is basically uh, 293 gives you culpable homicide, right? 294 gives you murder, right? If you all go through the sections, right, it's not relevant again. You all don't have to know the sections for murder and all that. Like, you all don't have to know the offense. But if you look at section 293, it's about culpable homicide. So if someone dies because of something, you can say that he's responsible to have caused that death. But again, you can take that defense. You can say his intention was not to kill him, but to cause bodily harm. But that bodily harm uh, was not likely under normal circumstances. Like his intention wasn't there to kill him. You can say that. Yes, that's a defense. If you take that defense, you can say it's culpable homicide, not amounting to murder, right? But he's still responsible for the death, right? His liability lies with the death, right? There he's criminally liable for the death. That's the idea of explanation mark, basically. So so culpable homicide also is about causing death, right? There is still death caused, right? So that's why it's they're still criminally liable for the death. Then under second explanation, this is also very important. We discussed this, right? Where death is caused by bodily injury, the person who causes such bodily injury shall be deemed to have caused the death, although by resorting to proper remedies and skillful treatment, the death might have been prevented. Now, this says, even though this says that the person is still responsible for the death, even if by resorting to proper remedies or treatment, the death would have been prevented. Now, that's the previous case was the best example, right? Even if she had, like, if she had resorted to blood transfusion, the death would not have happened, right? But even if she, through this explanation, what they mean is, even if there was a medical remedy available and if she did not resort to it and she died because of that, that person is still the person who, the offender is still liable for the death, right? Irrespective of whether that person opted for medical treatment or not, right? So that's the idea, right? You can take the defense again, but I'll get to that, right? So he's still liable for causing the death. So explanation 1, explanation 2 says that basically. Yeah. Any questions still there? No. Right. Sorry, there's a question. Oh, yeah. Then right, we'll continue the next segment. So next we have, this is sort of the last part of this. So that's coincidence and coexistence. Now these are yeah. Yes, sure. Yeah. So I haven't prepared a past paper question right now for this session. But what I'll do is I'll write an answer to a past paper question and I'll send it on the group. I think that's easier. If not, in a subsequent session, if I can get a bit of time, I'll try and do a past paper question. I haven't prepared a past paper question for now, but I'll try and answer one and send on the group. If not, if I have time on another day, I'll do a past paper question, right? Okay. So coincidence and coexistence. Coincidence is basically something that happens, again, is very similar to the challenges that I mentioned. Something that happens between the act and the consequence, resulting in the causal link being broken, right? Let's say now, again, 4th of December, someone is stabbed, right? And then on the 6th, he dies. Now on the 5th, if something had happened, that we could term as a coincidence. And this coincidence should break the causal connection with the accused, with the conduct with the accused. Now, the accused stabbed, let's say A stabs B, and B dies, A stabbed B on the 4th of December, and B died on the 6th of December. If something happened on the 5th of December, that would break that causal link. We call it a coincidence, right? So the best example is the Bush's case. This case is from US. So in the Bush's case, what happened was, I think it was, yeah. So the Bush's case is basically what happened was, a person was basically assaulted, right? And this assault, this by being assaulted, uh, she had obviously contracted a certain wound. Right? There was some sort of a wound that was created by this, right? But this wound was not fatal. Right? It was not sort of a it wouldn't have caused her death, right? But when she was taken to the hospital, in the hospital um, she had contracted a sort of like a viral flu at that time. And because of this fever, she died, right? She died because of that fever. Now, again, um, the offender was not directly liable for the death, right? He was not liable for the death. Why? Obviously, he did cause an injury, right? There was assault. You can convict him under assault, but you can't create a link between his action and the death. Why? Because now the death was caused by fever. Fever was not created by him. The fever was not something that he had injected onto him. The fever she had contracted was from a nurse in the hospital. A nurse in the hospital had fever, and she had contracted that fever from her, and she had died. Now, there again, you can't connect the chain between the act and the consequence is broken. Right? There's a different cause. Some other cause comes in, and that's the cause of death. And you can't connect that action to that cause. Right now, for an example, so the same case, right? Now she died because of fever. Now the cause of death, fever, right? Now you can't connect the person's injury. Now uh, she sustained injuries, right? Now the assault cannot be connected with the fever, right? And if it cannot be connected with the fever, then it cannot be connected with the death. Then he is not liable for the death. The offender is not liable for the death. But you can say he's liable for assault and all, but not liable for the death, right? There's no causal link between the assault and then the fever and then the death, right? So you can't create a link there. So that's coincidence, basically. Coexistence is basically, again, it's very similar to the multiple cases theory I mentioned. When there's multiple contributing factors, that sort of aggravates the consequence of the act, right? But at the same time, while it aggravates, the act is still the operative cause. So let's say someone dies. I'll use the Hayward case. So in the Hayward case, yeah, sorry. In the Hayward case, what happened was, in the Hayward case, what happened is, uh, so sorry. In the Hayward case, what happened was I got a bit distracted there. Sorry. Um, in the Hayward case, what happened was the wife in this instance was kicked by her husband, right? So the accused, basically. So the accused had kicked his wife, right? But the wife had a certain medical condition where this due to this medical condition, because she was kicked, and as a result of her condition, um, she had died, right? Because of the condition, she had died, right? So again, in this case, um, the accused was still made liable for the death. Why? Because now he had kicked the wife, right? So the wife, so whatever happened after that, of course, yes, her medical condition and all of that, but that um, the act of the accused is still the operative cause, right? It was, if the accused had not kicked her, she wouldn't have died, right? Again, though she had a medical condition, if he had not kicked her, she wouldn't have died, right? Again, it's still the operative cause, still the substantial cause of death, right? Or it's still responsible for the death. Now, if he hadn't done that, she would have survived, right? So in that sort of a case, again, he was convicted, right? So here what happens is coexistence. There are contributory factors. Though it's contributory, the act of the accused is still the operative cause, right? So that's the difference between coincidence and coexistence, right? Coincidence breaks the causal effect, but coexistence basically extends it, right? So the kick was, yes, assault, but then the link was like sort of extended by her medical condition to the extent that she died, right? And then he was convicted of manslaughter, right? So that's how it extended, right? So yeah, that's the Hayward case. Uh, then the um, then the Kolanda case. The Kolanda case was from it's a Sri Lankan case. So in the Kolanda case, what happened was a person basically had basically hit someone, or basically like basically struck him, right? Struck a person. Um, struck a person, which obviously is not something. Now, the blow he had struck was not something that would cause the death of a person, right? But this person, the victim of this action, had a ruptured spleen. So his spleen was ruptured, right? Uh, I don't know the medical condition of that, but then his spleen was ruptured, right? So because his spleen was ruptured, because of this blow, since the spleen was ruptured, things got worse and he died, right? So his spleen was ruptured, right? So the blow was made not to kill him, but still, because it had obviously hit the spleen, which was already ruptured, had made things worse and the person died, right? So again, he was charged of murder, right? But here different to the like a bit different to the previous case, since in Sri Lanka we have culpable homicide not amounting to murder, and since murder, uh, in murder, if you look at the definition of murder under 294, they've said that a person, the action should be committed with the intention of causing bodily injury likely to culminate in the death of the person as the offender knows, right? Now, the offender should know that whatever he is doing could cause death, right? He now striking a blow, that blow could cause death. He should have known that. Now he didn't know that, right? He didn't know that this person's spleen was ruptured, right? So his intention was not to kill him, right? Obviously, you can charge him under now since there was death, right? Since there was death, you can say using that explanation one that I mentioned, he's responsible for the murder. He's responsible for the death. He's responsible for the death. But then it's not murder. Why? His intention was not to kill him, right? His intention was not to kill him. He didn't know that whatever he was doing would have caused his death. If he had done something, he should have had the intention of causing a bodily harm which would cause the death of that person. So he should know that whatever he is doing is likely to cause it. But here he didn't know that. So because he didn't know that, it's murder. It's culpable homicide, not amounting to murder, right? It's not murder, right? So that's the important part, right? So that's how that case is different in a way, right? So yeah, that's the basic understanding there. Do you all have? There's a question. Yes. No, no, no. Yeah. So for culpable homicide, it's different, right? So yes. For murder, it's all about intention, right? So the intention to cause the death of a person, right? The bodily injury that you cause should cause the death of that person. You should know that, right? So under like you should know that that person would die, right? By whatever you're doing. So under murder, there's four limbs, right? The first three limbs are intention, and the fourth limb is knowledge, right? So when it comes to intention, uh, your intention should be to cause a bodily injury as the offender knows to be likely to cause the death of the person. So the offender should know that, right? So when it comes to murder, the mens rea element or the intention there should be of him knowing that whatever he's doing would cause the death, right? He should know that the bodily injury he's causing would cause the death, right? So that's there, right? But then when it comes to when it comes to culpable homicide. Now, culpable homicide again, it causes death. But the difference there is it's so culpable homicide again causes death. But how culpable homicide becomes murder is you do the action with the intention of killing him, and knowing that what you are doing will cause his death. Right. So that's the difference. So culpable homicide, then murder. So without culpable homicide, there's obviously no murder, right? But there could be culpable homicide without murder. That's the idea, right? So the first stage or the first culpable homicide, then murder, right? So culpable homicide and murder differs. Why? Because under murder, the intention was to kill him while knowing that what you're doing would kill him, right? You have the intention of killing him, but you should also know that what you're doing kills him as well. So that's the idea. Yeah. Is that clear? Any other questions? Any other questions? If you all have any questions, you all can post it now. If not, you all can just drop your message as well. You all can ask now, or if you all have questions later, right? Yeah. So I'll send this note on the group, and there are a few other cases as well to be added to this. I'll add those cases with a small summary of these cases as well. Then it's easier for you all to understand the cases that I mentioned. So just go through that, and I'll do a past paper question and send on the group. And if I can, I'll try and discuss one as well in the future if we have time, right? Yeah, so that's basically it on causation. Any questions again last time? If you all have any questions, you all can post it now. Okay, I'll take that as a no then. So again, if you all have questions, just drop me a message or drop a message on the group. Anything is fine. Yeah, so that's basically it. And if you all have any feedback about the session as well, just let us know if there's anything like you want us to slow down or something better, like some improvements that we can do, just let us know, right? Yeah, so that's basically it. Thank you for joining. I'll see you all in the next session.
Thank you. Bye.